Hi again. Today I'm going to return to the subject of music with a book which is the most recent of the many thousands of books that have been written about the Beatles. The Beatles as a group, individually, their locations, their musical instruments, their writing, the analysis of the songs, covered extensively in, as I say, literally thousands of books. So to produce a book now which stands out from the mass of books really is a substantial feat of writing. And the book I'm going to talk about today, The Beatles 1963 by Dafydd Rees, takes every day in the year 1963 and gives us a synopsis of what the Beatles were up to, subtitled A Year in the Life. It really puts what the lads were up to on that particular day with some highlights of news items, local, national, international events that were happening at the same time. But then, interestingly, there's boxes with interviews with people who were there, usually on that specific day. Fans, venue staff, journalists, other musicians, and so on. And they give you a much more intimate look at the activities of the Beatles during that time. The book opens New Year's Eve of 62 with the Beatles just finishing 13 nights playing at the Star Club Hamburg and concluding their fifth and final visit to Hamburg. The following day, they flew back to London. The flight was delayed, stayed overnight in London, and then took a flight to begin a tour. They'd been anxious to get back to the UK because their first single, Love Me Do, had been climbing the charts, and they wanted to promote it and capitalise on it. And they obviously wanted that to take place back home in the UK. So they were about to start a major tour. Now, January of 1963 heralded one of the worst winters we've ever experienced. In Liverpool, the water on Sefton Park Lake froze to such an extent you could skate on it. On the south coast, the ports around Kent, etc., were frozen solid. The seawater froze. So if the south coast was like that, you can imagine what the north was like. And the Beatles were headed to Scotland, the most northerly part of the UK, where the weather was truly atrocious. Huge snow drifts, roads blocked, impassable, pipes burst, electricity cut off. This was all over the country, but nowhere worse than Scotland. So they were scheduled to fly to Edinburgh. The flight was diverted to Aberdeen, and yet Neil Aspinall, their road manager, had already driven to Edinburgh with all their equipment in a transit van. So they had to link up with him and then start touring. Now, musicians talk about paying their dues, and the Beatles certainly did. From their first visits to Hamburg, where they were playing endless hours in the cellars of the red light district, to now touring Scotland in an unheated van, no motorways, staying in rather small hotels, sometimes bed and breakfasts, snow, ice, fog. It must have been truly miserable, and yet they were excited about it. And it's a tribute to the fans who turned out to go to the concerts, to go to the dances where the Beatles were playing. Now, as the interviews show, not all of the fans had gone specifically to see the Beatles. Sometimes it was their local dance hall, and they always went on a particular night to see whoever was on. But almost universally, they were electrified by the Beatles. This was something different, something they'd never experienced before. Those who got to meet them were struck by their humour, by their friendliness, and also obviously their professionalism on stage and the music they were playing. Nobody else was doing this. So this tour of Scotland really proved the professionalism and their commitment to succeeding in the popular music business. On the 11th of January, their second single, Please Please Me, was released and started gaining attention. Now, to sidetrack for a moment, those of us who were around at the time have a completely different view of Love Me Do and Please Please Me than people who came to the Beatles music as an already existing complete set of tracks. And the context of Love Me Do was against what else was around at the time, and it was markedly different from the great mass of pop music that was being played generally just on the BBC. There wasn't really anything else, or performed by groups that you went to see. Obviously, those of us in Liverpool were aware of the Beatles and we were predisposed to like them, but really Love Me Do was a really good song, and it stands the test of time. You can play it today. Please Please Me was an order of magnitude better. It was a much better song, and the production was terrific, and the energy, the cheerfulness, and the beat of Please Please Me made it an instant hit. And I remember the first time I heard it, I liked it the first time I heard it, and I like it today. It really was good. And when they finished recording it, you know, it's well known that George Martin called down from the control booth in Abbey Road and said, "Boys, that was your first number one." And he was right. On some of the charts it went to number one. And it's still a terrific pop song. And the thing about it was completely different from Love Me Do. And then the subsequent singles were all different from Please Please Me and from each other. And that was not how pop music worked at the time. If you had a hit, your next song would be very, very similar. It would be much in the same vein. For example, How Do You Do It by excuse me, Jerry and the Pacemakers, written by Mitch Murray. Their follow-up was almost an identical song, and that was how the music business was then. Beatles broke the mold. On the 11th of February, exactly a month later, the boys returned to Abbey Road to record their first album. This is obviously detailed in the book. And they recorded 10 tracks because they already had 4, the 2 singles and the B-sides of them in the can. So they had to record 10 tracks, and they did it all in a day. Some took several takes, and I think one of them took just 1 take to get. And it was a tour de force. When you consider now groups go in for 9 months into the studio to record something. And the freshness of the album, which was released as Please Please Me, was terrific. Basically, as the book says, it was their stage show. It was how the numbers they were performing on stage, many of them covers. They hadn't fully started using their own material. That started to come. So the interviews with the fans and the fellow musicians and so on were quite illuminating. Quite a few of them remarked that they had their musical world completely rocked, to use a pun, by the Beatles. It changed them. You know, they veered from the then orthodoxy into the path of the Beatles and became lifelong fans. Touching story from one young fan. She saw a lot of the Beatles, got their autographs on her copy of Love Me Do and so on, collected photos, collected cuttings, a lot of stuff. But when she got married, her mother threw it all in the bin, and would have been worth a lot, financially and also memory-wise today. So we await the second volume of Mark Lewison's absolutely painstaking and detailed and exhaustive history of the Beatles. But until then, this book, Beatles 1963, gives us a real close look at that portion of their history. And it gives us pleasure in looking back to what was the start of Beatlemania, which was really the start of the process which has led right through to this present day of the Beatles being the biggest band in the world in history.